Good evening. I hope everyone's doing all right tonight. Sorry about canceling on Thursday. We had a bunch of storms coming through our area. I didn't want the stream to get interrupted by lightning, thunder, power going out. So I had canceled. But yeah, so we'll be picking back up with Plague Ship by Andre Norton. And we are on chapter 5. So if you are reading along with me, feel free to pick up there. Chapter 5, The Perilous Seas. The Gorp hunters straggled through the grass forest in family groups, and the Terrans saw that the Enterprise had forced another uneasy truce upon the district, for there were representatives from more than just Path's own clan. All the Salariki were young, and the parties babbled together in excitement. It was plain that this hunt, staged upon a large scale, was not only a means of revenge upon a hated enemy, but also a sporting event of outstanding prestige. Now the grass trees began to show ragged gaps, open spaces between their clumps, until the forest was only scattered groups, and the party the Terrans had joined walked along a trail cloaked in knee-high yellow-red fern growth. Most of the Salariki carried unlit torches, some having 4 or 5 bundled together as if Gorp hunting must be done after nightfall. And it was fairly late in the afternoon before they topped a rise of ground and looked out upon one of Sargol's seas. The water was a dull metallic gray, broken by great swaths of purple, as if an artist had slapped a brush of color across it in a hit-or-miss fashion. Sand of the red grit, lightened by the golden flecks which glittered in the sun, stretched to the edge of the wavelets, breaking with only languor on the curve of the earth. The bulk of islands arose in serried ranks farther out, crowned with grass trees, all rippling under the sea wind. They came out upon the beach, where one of the purple patches touched the shore, and Dane noted that it left a scummy deposit there. The Terrans went on to the water's edge, where it was clear of the purple stuff. They could get a murky glimpse of the bottom, but the scum hid long stretches of shoreline and outer wave, and Dane wondered if the Gorp used it as protective covering. For the moment, the Salariki made no move toward the sea which was to be their hunting ground. Instead, the youngest members of the party, some of whom were adolescents not yet entitled to wear the claw knife of manhood, spread out along the shore and set industriously to gathering driftwood, which they brought back to heap on the sand. Dane, watching that harvest, caught sight of a smoothly polished length. He called Week's attention to the water-rounded cylinder. The oiler's eyes lighted, and he stooped to pick it up. Where the other sticks were from grass trees, this was something else, and among the bleached pile it had the vividness of flame, for it was a strident scarlet. Weeks turned it over in his hands, running his fingers lovingly across its perfect grain. Even in this crude state it had beauty. He stopped the Salaric, who had just brought in another armload of wood. "This is what?" He spoke the trade lingo haltingly. The native gazed somewhat indifferently at the branch. "Tansel," he answered. "It grows on the islands." He made a vague gesture to include a good section of the western sea before he hurried away. Weeks now went along the tide line on his own quest, Dane trailing him. At the end of a quarter hour, when a hail summoned them back to the site of the now lighted fire, they had some 10 pieces of the tansel wood between them. The finds ranged from a 3-foot section some 4 inches in diameter to some slender twigs no longer than a riding stilo, but all with high polish, the warm flame coloring. Week slashed them together before he joined the group where Groft was outlining the technique of Gorp hunting for the benefit of the Terrans. Some 200 feet away, a reef, often awash and stained with the purple scum, angled out into the sea in a long curve which formed a natural breakwater. This was the point of attack. But first the purple film must be removed so that the land and sea dwellers could meet on common terms. The fire blazed up, eating hungrily into the driftwood, and from it ran the young Salariki with lighted brands which at the water's edge they whirled about their heads and then hurled out onto the purple patches. Fire arose from the water and ran with frantic speed across the crests of the low waves, while the Salariki coughed and buried their noses in their perfume boxes, for the wind drove shoreward an overpowering stench. Where the cleansing fire had run on the water, there was now only a natural metallic gray of the liquid. The cover was gone. Older Salariki warriors were choosing torches from those they had brought, doing it with care. Groft approached the Terrans carrying four. "These you use now." What for? Dane wondered. The sky was still sunlit. He held the torch, watching to see how the Salariki made use of them. Groft led the advance, running lightly out along the reef with agile and graceful leaps to cross the breaks where the sea hurled in over the rock, and after him followed the other natives, each with a lighted torch in hand, the torch they hunkered down to plant firmly in some crevice of the rock before taking a stand beside that beacon. The Terrans, less sure-footed in space boots, picked their way along the same path, wet with spray, wrinkling their noses against the lingering puffs of the stench from the water. Following the example of the Salariki, they faced seaward, but Dane did not know what to watch for. Cam had left only the vaguest general descriptions of Gorp, and beyond the fact that they were reptilian, intelligent, and dangerous, the Terrans had not been briefed. Once the warriors had taken up their stand along the reef, the younger Salariki went into action once more. Lighting more torches at the fire, they ran out along the line of their elders and flung their torches as far as they could hurl them into the sea outside the reef. The gray steel of the water was now yellow with the reflection of the sinking sun, but that ochre and gold became more brilliant yet as the torches of the Salariki set blazing up far floating patches of scum. Dane shielded his eyes against the glare and tried to watch the water with some idea that this move must be provocation and what they hunted would be driven into view. He held his sleep rod ready, just as the Salaric on his right had claw knife in one hand and in the other, open and waiting, the net intended to entangle and hold fast a victim, binding him for the kill. But it was at the far tip of the barrier, the post of greatest honor which Groft had jealously claimed as his, that the Gorp struck first. At a wild shout of defiance, Dane half turned to see the Salaric noble cast his net at sea level and then stab viciously with a well-practiced blow. When he raised his arm for a second thrust, greenish ichor ran from the blade down his wrist. "Dane!" Thorson's head jerked around. He saw the V of ripples headed straight for the rocks where he balanced, but he'd have to wait for a better target than a moving wedge of water. Instinctively he half-crouched, in the stance of an embattled spaceman, wishing now that he did have a blaster. Neither of the Salariki stationed on either side of him made any move, and he guessed that was hunt etiquette. Each man was supposed to face and kill the monster that challenged him without assistance. And upon his skill during the next few minutes might rest the reputation of all Terrans as far as the natives were concerned. There was a shadow outline beneath the surface of the metallic water now, but he could not see well because of the distortion of the murky waves. He must wait until he was sure. Then the thing gave a spurt, and only inches beyond the toes of his boots a nightmare creature sprang halfway out of the water, pincer claws as long as his own arm snapping at him. Without being conscious of his act, he pressed the stud of the sleep rod, aiming in the general direction of that horror from the sea. But to his utter amazement, the creature did not fall supinely back into the watery world from which it had emerged. Instead, those claws snapped again, this time scraping across the top of Dane's foot, leaving a furrow in material the keenest of knives could not have scored. "Give it to him!" That was Rip shouting encouragement from his own place farther along the reef. Dane pressed the firing stud again and again. The claws waved as the monstrosity slavered from a gaping frog's mouth, a mouth which was fanged with a shark's vicious teeth. It was almost wholly out of the water, creeping on a crab's many legs, with a clawed upper limb reaching for him, when suddenly it stopped, its huge head turning from side to side in the sheltering carapace of scaled natural armor. It settled back as if crouching for a final spring, a spring which would push Dane into the ocean, but that attack never came. Instead, the Gorp drew in upon itself until it resembled an unwieldy ball of indestructible armor, and there it remained. The Salariki on either side of Dane let out cries of triumph and edged closer. One of them twirled his net suggestively, seeing that the Terran lacked what was to him an essential piece of hunting equipment. Dane nodded vigorously in agreement, and the tough strands swung out in a skillful cast which engulfed the motionless creature on the reef. But it was so protected by its scales there was no opening for the claw knife. They had made a capture, but they could not make a kill. However, the Salariki were highly delighted, and several abandoned their post to help the boys drag the monster ashore, where it was pinned down to the beach by stakes and driven through the edges of the net. But the hunting party was given little time to gloat over this stroke of fortune. The Gorp killed by Groft and the one stunned by Dane were only the van of an army, and within moments the hunters on the reef were confronted by trouble armed with slashing claws and diabolic fighting ability. The battle was anything but one-sided. Dane whirled as the air was rent by a shriek of agony, just in time to see one of the Salariki, already torn by the claws of a Gorp, being drawn under the water. It was too late to save the hunter, though Dane, balanced on the very edge of the reef, aimed a beam into the bloody waves. If the Gorp was affected by this attack, he could not tell, for both attacker and victim could no longer be seen. But Ali had better luck in rescuing the Salaric who shared his particular section of reef, and the native, gashed and spurting blood from a wound in his thigh, was hauled to safety, while the Gorp, coiling too slowly under the Terran ray, was literally hewn to pieces by the revengeful knives of the hunter's kin. The fight broke into a series of individual duels, carried on now by the light of the torches as the evening closed in. The last of the purple patches had burned away to nothing. Dane crouched by his standard torch, his eyes fastened on the sea, waiting for an ominous V of ripples betraying another Gorp on its way to launch against the rock barrier. There was such wild confusion along that line of water-sprayed rocks that he had no idea of how the engagement was going. But so far, the Gorp showed no signs of having had enough. Dane was shaken out of his absorption by another scream, one, he was sure, which had not come from any Salariki throat. He got to his feet. Rip was stationed 4 men beyond him. Yes, the tall astrogator apprentice was there, outlined against torch flare. Ali? No, there was the assistant engineer. Weeks? But Weeks was picking his way back along the reef toward the shore, haste expressed in every line of his figure. The scream sounded for a second time, freezing the Terrans. "Come back!" That was Weeks, gesturing violently at the shore and something floundering in the protecting circle of the reef. The younger Salariki, who had been feeding the fire, were now clustered at the water's edge. Ali ran, and with a leap covered the last few feet, landing reckless, knee-deep in the waves. Dane saw light strike on his rod as he swung it in a wide arc to center on the struggles, churning the water into foam. A third scream died to a moan, and then the Salariki dashed into the sea, their nets spread, drawing back with them through the surf a dark and now quiet mass. The fact that at least one Gorp had managed to get on the inner side of the reef made an impression on the rest of the native hunters. After an uncertain minute or two, Groft gave the signal to withdraw, which they did with grisly trophies. Dane counted 7 Gorp bodies, which did not include the prisoner ashore, and more might have slid into the sea to die. On the other hand, 2 Salariki were dead. One had been drawn into the sea before Dane's eyes, and at least one was badly wounded, but who had been pulled down in the shallows? Someone sent out from the Queen with a message? Dane raced back along the reef, not waiting to pull up his torch, and before he reached the shore, Rip was overtaking him, but the man who lay groaning on the sand was not from the Queen. The torn and blood-stained tunic covering his lacerated shoulders had the IS badge. Ali was already at work on his wounds, giving temporary first aid from his belt kit. To all their questions he was stubbornly silent. Either he couldn't, or wouldn't, answer. In the end, they helped the Salariki rig 3 stretchers. On one, the largest, the captive Gorp, still curled in a round, carapace-protected ball, was bound with a net. The second supported the wounded Salaric clansman, and onto the third the Terrans lifted the IS man.
"We'll deliver him to his own ship," Rip decided. "He must have tailed us here as a spy."
He asked a passing Salaric as to where they could find the company spacer.
"They might just think we are responsible," Ali pointed out, "but I see your point. If we do pack him back to the Queen and he doesn't make it, they might say that we fired his rockets for him. All right, boys, let's up ship. He doesn't look too good to me."
With a torch-bearing Salaric boy as a guide, they hurried along a path, taking in turns the burdens of the stretcher. Luckily, the IS ship was even closer to the sea than the Queen, and as they crossed the slagged ground, congealed by the break fire, they were trotting. Though the company ship was probably one of the smallest intersolar carried on her rosters, it was a third again as large as the Queen, with part of that third undoubtedly dedicated to extra cargo space. Beside her, their own spacer would seem not only smaller, but battered and worn. But no free trader would have willingly assumed the badges of a company man, not even for the command of such a ship fresh from the cradles of a builder. When a man went up from the training pool for his first assignment, he was sent to the ship where his temperament, training, and abilities best fitted, and those who were designated as free traders would never fit into the pattern of company men. Of late years, the breach between those who lived under the strict parental control of one of the 5 great galaxy-wide organizations and those still too much of an individual to live any life but that of a half-explorer, half-pioneer, which was the free traders, had widened alarmingly. Antagonism flared, rivalry was strong, but as yet the great companies themselves were at polite cold war with one another for the big plums of the scattered systems. The free traders took the crumbs, and there was not much disputing, save in cases such as had arisen on Sargol, when suddenly crumbs assumed the guise of very rich cake, rich and large enough to attract a giant. The party from the Queen was given a peremptory challenge as they reached the other ship's ramp. Rip demanded to see the officer of the watch and then told the story of the wounded man as far as they knew it. The IC was hurried aboard, nor did his shipmates give a word of thanks.
"Well, that's that," Rip shrugged. "Let's go before they slam the hatch so hard they'll rock their ship off her fins."
Polite, aren't they?" asked Weeks mildly.
"What do you expect of ICs?" Ali wanted to know. "To them, free traders are just rim planet trash. Let's report back to where we are appreciated."
They took a shortcut which brought them back to the Queen, and they filed up her ramp to make their report to the captain. But they were not yet satisfied with Groft and his Gorp slayers. No Salaric appeared for trade in the morning, surprising the Terrans. Instead, a second delegation, this time of older men and a storm priest, visited the spacer with an invitation to attend Paft's funeral feast, a rite which would be followed by the formal elevation of Groft to his father's position, now that he had revenged that parent. And from remarks dropped by members of the delegation, it was plain that the bearing of the Terrans who had joined the hunting party was esteemed to have been in highest accord with Salariki tradition. They drew lots to decide which 2 must remain with the ship, and the rest perfumed themselves so as to give no offense which might upset their now cordial relations. Again, it was mid-afternoon when the Salariki escort sent to do them honor waited at the edge of the wood, and Mura and Tang saw them off. With a herald booming before them, they traveled the beaten earth road in the opposite direction from the trading center, off through the forest until they came to a wide section of several miles which had been rigorously cleared of any vegetation which might give cover to a lurking enemy. In the center of this was a 12-foot-high stockade of the bright red burnished wood which had attracted Weeks on the shore. Each paling was the trunk of a tree, and it had been sharpened at the top to a wicked point. On the field side was a wide ditch, crossed at the gate by a bridge, the planking of which might be removed at will, and as Dane passed over, he looked down into the moat that was dry. The Salariki did not depend on water for a defense, but on something else which his experience of the previous night had taught him to respect. There was no mistaking that shade of purple. The highly flammable scum the hunters had burnt from the top of the waves had been brought inland and lay, a greasy blanket, some 8 feet below. It would only be necessary to toss a torch on that, and the defenders of the stockade would create a wall of fire to baffle any attackers. Salariki knew how to make the most of their world's natural resources. Chapter 6. Duelist's Challenge. Inside the Red Stockade there was a crowded community. The Salariki demanded privacy of a kind, and even the unmarried warriors did not share barracks, but each had a small cubicle of his own. So that the mud brick and timber erections of one of their clan cities resembled nothing so much as the comb cells of a busy beehive. Although Paths was considered a large clan, it numbered only about 200 fighting men and their numerous wives, children, and captive servants. Not all of them normally lived at this center, but for the funeral feasting they had assembled, which meant a lot of doubling up and tenting out under makeshift cover between the regular buildings of the town, such that the Terrans were glad to be guided through this crowded maze to the great hall which was its heart. As the trading center had been, the hall was a circular enclosure open to the sky above, but divided in wheel-spoke fashion with the posts of the red wood, each supporting a metal basket filled with inflammable material. Here were no lowly stools or trading tables. One vast circular board, broken only by a gap at the foot, ran completely around the wall. At the end opposite the entrance was the high chair of the chieftain, set on a 2-step dais. Though the feast had not yet officially begun, the Terrans saw that the majority of the places were already occupied. They were led around the perimeter of the enclosure to places not far from the high seat. Van Rieke settled down with a grunt of satisfaction. It was plain that the free traders were numbered among the nobility. They could be sure of good trade in days to come. Delegations from neighboring clans arrived in close companies of 10 or 12 and were granted seats, as had been the Terrans, in groups. Dane noted that there was no intermingling of clan with clan, and, as they were to understand later that night, there was very good reason for that precaution. "Hope all our adaptation shots work," Ali murmured, eyeing with no pleasure at all the succession of platters now being borne through the inner opening of the table. While the traders had learned long ago that the wisest part of valor was not to sample alien strong drinks, ceremony often required that they break bread, or its other world equivalent, on strange planets. And so science served expediency, and now a trader bound for any galactic banquet was immunized, as far as was medically possible, against the evil consequences of consuming food not originally intended for Terran stomachs. One of the results being that traders acquired a far-flung reputation of possessing bird-like appetites, since it was always better to nibble and live than to gorge and die. Groft had not yet taken his place in the vacant chieftain's chair. For the present he stood in the center of the table circle, directing the captive servants who circulated with the food. Until the magic moment when the clans themselves would proclaim their overlord, he remained merely the eldest son of the house, relatively without power. As the endless rows of platters made their way about the table and the basket lights on the tops of the pillars were ignited, dispelling the dusk of evening, and there was an attendant stationed by each to throw on handsful of aromatic bark which burned with puffs of lavender smoke, adding to the many warring scents. The Terrans had recourse at intervals to their own pungent smelling bottles, merely to clear their heads of the drugging fumes. Luckily, Dane thought as the feast proceeded that smoke from the braziers went straight up. Had they been in a roofed space, they might have been overcome. As it was, were they entirely conscious of all that was going on around them? His reason for that speculation was the dance now being performed in the center of the hall, their fight with the Gorp being enacted in a series of bounds and stabbings. He was sure that he could no longer trust his eyes when the claw knife of the victorious dancer-hunter apparently passed through the chest of another wearing a grotesque monster mask. As a fitting climax to their horrific display, 3 of the men who had been with them on the reef entered, dragging behind them, still enmeshed in the hunting net, the Gorp which Dane had stunned. It was uncurled now, and very much alive, but the pincer claws which might have cut its way to safety were encased in balls of hard substance. Freed from the net, suspended by its sealed claws, the gorp swung back and forth from a standard setup before the high seat. Its murderous jaws snapped futilely, and from it came an enraged snake's vicious hissing. Though totally in the power of its enemies, it gave an impression of terrifying strength and menace. The sight of their ancient foe aroused the Salariki and flaming warriors who leaned across the table to hurl tongue-twisting invective at the captive monster. Dane gathered that seldom had a living gorp been delivered helpless into their hands, and they proposed to make the most of this wonderful opportunity. And the Terran suddenly wished the monstrosity had fallen back into the sea. He had no soft thoughts for the gorp after what he had seen at the reef and the tales he had heard, but neither did he like what he saw now expressed in gestures, heard in the tones of voices about them. A storm priest put an end to the outcries. His dun cloak making a spot of darkness amid all the flashing color, he came straight to the place where the gorp swung. As he took his stand before the wriggling creature, the din gradually faded. The warriors settled back into their seats. A pool of quiet spread through the enclosure. Groft came up to take his position beside the priest. With both hands he carried a two-handled cup. It was not the ornamented goblet which stood before each diner, but a manifestly older artifact, fashioned of some dull black substance and having the appearance of being even older than the hall or the town. One of the warriors who had helped to bring in the gorp now made a quick and accurate cast with a looped rope, snaring the monster's head and pulling back almost at a right angle. With deliberation, the storm priest produced a knife, the first straight-bladed weapon Dane had seen on Sargol. He made a single thrust in the soft underpart of the gorp's throat. Catching in the cup, he took from Groft some of the ichor which spurted from the wound. The gorp thrashed madly, spattering table and surrounding Salariki with its life fluid, but the attention of the crowd was riveted elsewhere. Into the old cup the priest poured another substance from a flask brought by an underling. He shook the cup back and forth as if to mix its contents thoroughly, and then handed it to Groft. Holding it before him, the young chieftain leaped to the tabletop, and so to stand before the high seat. There was a hush throughout the enclosure. Now even the gorp had ceased its wild struggles and hung limp in its bonds. Groft raised the cup above his head and gave a loud shout in the archaic language of his clan. He was answered by a chant from the warriors who would in battle follow his banner, chant punctuated with the clinking slap of knife blades brought down forcibly on the board. 3 times he recited some formula and was answered by the others. Then, in another period of sudden quiet, he raised the cup to his lips and drank off its contents in a single draught, turning the goblet upside down when he had done to prove that not a drop remained within. A shout tore through the great hall. The Salariki were all on their feet, waving their knives over their heads to honor their new ruler, and Groft, for the first time, seated himself in the high seat. The clan was no longer without a chieftain. Groft held his father's place.
"Show over?" Dane heard Stott's murmur in Venriki's disappointing reply. "Not yet. They'll probably make a night of it. Here comes another round of drinks." "And trouble with them." That was Captain Jellicoe being prophetic. "By the coal sack's ripcord!" That exclamation had been jolted out of Rip, and Dane turned to see what had so jarred the usually serene astrogator apprentice. He was just in time to witness an important piece of Sargolian social practice. A young warrior, surely only within a year or so of receiving his knife, was facing an older Salaric, both on their feet. The head and shoulder fur of the older fighter was dripping wet, and an empty goblet rolled across the table to bump to the floor. A hush had fallen on the immediate neighbors of the pair, and there was an air of expectancy about the company. Threw his drink all over the other fellow, Rip Softwifter explained. That means a duel.
Here and now? Dane had heard of the personal combat proclivities of the Salariki.
Should be to the death for an insult such as that, Ali remarked, as usual surveying the scene from his chosen role as bystander.
As a child, he had survived the unspeakable massacres of the Crater War. Nothing had been able to crack his surface armor since.
The young fool! That was Steen Wilcox sizing up the situation from the angle of a naturally cautious nature and some 15 years of experience on a great many different worlds. He'll be mustered out for good before he knows what happened to him.
The younger Salaric had barked a question at his elder and had been promptly answered by that dripping warrior. Now their neighbors came to life with an efficiency which suggested that they had been waiting for such a move. It had happened so many times that every man knew just the right procedure from that point on. In order for a Sargolian feast to be a success, the Terrans gathered from overheard remarks at least one duel must be staged some time during the festivities, and those not actively engaged did a lot of brisk betting in the background.
Look there, at that fellow in the violet cloak, Rip directed Dane. See what he just laid down?
The nobleman in the violet cloak was not one of Groff's liege men, but a member of the delegation from another clan, and what he had laid down on the table, indicating as he did so his choice as winner in the coming combat. The elder warrior was a small piece of white material in which reposed a slightly withered but familiar leaf. The neighbor he wagered with eyed the stake narrowly, bending over to sniff at it before he piled up 2 gem-set armlets, a personal scent box, and a thumb-ringed balance. At this practical indication of just how much the Terran herb was esteemed, Dane regretted anew their earlier ignorance. He glanced along the board and saw that Van Rieke had noted that stake and was calling their captain's attention to it. But such side issues were forgotten as the duelists vaulted into the circle rimmed by the table, a space now vacated for their actions. They were stripped to their loincloths, their cloaks thrown aside. Each carried his net in his right hand, his claw-knife ready in his left. As yet, the traders had not seen Salaric against Salaric in action, and in spite of themselves they edged forward in their seats, as intent as the natives upon what was to come. The finer points of the combat were lost on them, and they did not understand the drilled casts of the net which had become as formalized throughout the centuries as the ancient and now almost forgotten sword-play of their own world. The young Salaric had greater agility and speed, but the veteran who faced him had the experience. To Terran eyes, the duel had some of the weaving, sweeping movements of the earlier ritual dance. The swift evasions of the nets were graceful and so timed that many times the meshes grazed the skin of the fighter who fled entrapment. Dane believed that the elder man was tiring, and the youngster must have shared that opinion. There was a leap to the right, a sudden flurry of dart and retreat, and then a net curled high and fell, enfolding flailing arms and kicking legs. When the clutch rope was jerked tight, the captured youth was thrown off balance. He rolled frenziedly, but there was no escaping the imprisoning strands. A shout applauded the victor. He stood now above his captive, who lay supine, his throat or breast ready for either stroke of the knife his captor wished to deliver, but it appeared that the winner was not minded to end the encounter with blood. Instead, he reached out a long, befurred arm, took up a filled goblet from the table, and with serious deliberation poured its contents onto the upturned face of the loser. For a moment, there was a dead silence around the feast board, and then a second roar, to which the honestly relieved Terrans added spurts of laughter. The sputtering youth was shaken free of the net and went down on his knees, tendering his opponent his knife, which the other thrust along with his own into his sash belt. Dane gathered from overheard remarks that the younger man was, for a period of time to be determined by clan council, now the servant of his overthrower, and that since they were closely united by blood ties, this solution was considered eminently suitable, though had the elder killed his opponent, no one would have thought the worse of him for that deed. It was the Queen's men who were to provide the next center of attraction. Groft climbed down from his high seat and came to face across the board those who had accompanied him on the hunt. This time there was no escaping the sipping of the potent drink which the new chieftain slopped from his own goblet into each of theirs. The fiery mouthful almost gagged Dane, but he swallowed manfully and hoped for the best as it burned like acid down his throat into his middle, there to mix uncomfortably with the viands he had eaten. Week's thin face looked very white, and Dane noticed with malicious enjoyment that Ali had an unobtrusive grip on the table which made his knuckles stand out in polished knobs, proving that there were things which could upset the imperturbable Kamil. Fortunately, they were not required to empty that flowing bowl in one gulp as Groft had done. The ceremonial mouthful was deemed enough, and Dane sat down thankfully but with uneasy fears for the future. Groft had started back to his high seat when there was an interruption which had not been foreseen. A messenger threaded his way among the serving men and spoke to the chieftain, who glanced at the Terrans and then nodded. Dane, his queasiness growing every second, was not attending until he heard a bitten-off word from Rip's direction and looked up to see a party of IS men coming into the open space before the high seat. The men from the Queen stiffened. There was something in the attitude of the newcomers which hinted at trouble.
"What do you wish, Skylords?"
That was Groft using the trade lingo, his eyes half closed as he lolled in his chair of state, almost as if he were about to witness some entertainment provided for his pleasure. "We wish to offer you the good fortune desires of our heart." That was Kali, the flowery words rolling with the proper accent from his tongue. "And that you shall not forget us. We also offer gifts." At a gesture from their cargo master, the IS men set down a small chest. Groft, his chin resting on a clenched fist, lost none of his lazy air.
"They are received," he retorted with the formal acceptance, "and no one can have too much good fortune. The howlers of the Black Wind know that."
But he tendered no invitation to join the feast. Kali did not appear disconcerted. His next move was one which took his rivals by surprise in spite of their suspicions. "Under the laws of fellowship, O Groft," he clung to the formal speech, "I claim redress." Ali's hand moved. Through his growing distress, Dane saw Vanriki's jaw tighten, the fighting mask snap back on Captain Jellicoe's face. Whatever came now was real trouble. Groft's eyes flickered over the party from the Queen. Though he had just pledged cup friendship with 4 of them, he had the malicious humor of his race. He would make no move to head off what might be coming.
"By the right of the knife in the net," he intoned, "you have the power to claim personal satisfaction. Where is your enemy?"
Khalid turned to face the free traders. "I hereby challenge a champion to be set out from these off-worlders to meet, by the blood and by the water, my champion." Salariki were getting excited. This was superb entertainment, an engagement such as they had never hoped to see. Alien against alien. The rising murmur of their voices was like the growl of a hunting beast. Groft smiled, and the pleasure that expression displayed was neither Terran nor human. But then the clan leader was not either, Dane reminded himself.
4 of these warriors are clan-bound," he said, "but the others may produce a champion."
Dane looked along the line of his comrades. Ali, Rip, Weeks, and himself had just been ruled out. That left Jellicoe, Vanriki, Carl Costi, the giant jetman whose strength they had to rely upon before, Stotts the engineer, Medic Tau, and Steen Wheelcox. If it were strength alone, he would have chosen Costi, but the big man was not too quick a thinker. Jellicoe got to his feet, the embodiment of a Star-Lane fighting man. In the flickering light of the scar on his cheek seemed to ripple.
"Who's your champion?" he asked Kali.
The icy cargo master was grinning. He was confident he had pushed them into a position from which they could not extricate themselves. "You accept challenge?" he countered. Jellicoe merely repeated his question, and Kali beckoned forward one of his men. The icy who stepped up was no match for Costi. He was a slender, almost wand-slim young man, whose pleased smirk said that he too was about to put something over on the notorious free traders. Jellicoe studied him for a couple of long seconds, during which the hum of Salariki voices was the threatening buzz of a disturbed wasp nest. There was no way out of this. To refuse conflict was to lose all they had won with the clansmen, and they did not doubt that Callie had in some way triggered the scales against them. Jellicoe made the best of it. "We accept challenge." His voice was level. "We, being guesting in Groff's holding, will fight after the manner of the Salariki, who are proven warriors." He paused as the roars of pleased acknowledgment arose around the board. "Therefore let us follow the custom of warriors, and take up the net and the knife." Was there a shade of dismay on Callie's face? "And the time?" Groff leaned forward to ask, but his satisfaction at such a fine ending for his feast was apparent. This would be talked over by every Sargolian for many storm seasons to come. Jellicoe glanced up at the sky. "Say, an hour after dawn, chieftain. With your leave we shall confer concerning a champion." "My council room is yours." Groff signed for a liege man to guide them. Chapter 7. Barring Accident. The morning winds rustled through the grass forest, and closer to hand it pulled at the cloaks of the Salariki. Clan nobles sat on stools, lesser folk squatted on the trampled stubble of the cleared ground outside the stockade. In their many-colored splendor, of the drab tunics of the Terrans were a blot of darkness at either end of the makeshift arena which had been marked out for them. At the conclusion of their conference, the Queen's men had been forced into a course Jellicoe had urged from the first. He, and he alone, would represent the free traders in the coming duel. And now he stood there in the early morning, stripped down to shorts and boots, wearing nothing on which a net could catch and so trap him. The free traders were certain that the IS men, having any advantage, would press it to the ultimate limit, and the death of Captain Jellicoe would make a great impression on the Salariki. Jellicoe was taller than the icy who faced him, but almost as lean. Hard muscles moved under his skin, pale where space tan had not burned in the years of his star voyaging, and his every movement was with the liquid grace of a man who in his time had been the master of the force blade. Now he gripped in his left hand the claw knife given him by Groff himself, and in the other he looped the throwing rope of the net. At the other end of the field, the icy man was industriously moving his boot soles back and forth across the ground, intent upon coating them with as much of the gritty sand as would adhere, and he displayed the supreme confidence in himself which he had shown in the moment of the challenge at the Great Hall. None of the free trading party made the mistake of trying to give Jellicoe advice. The captain had not risen to his command without learning his duties, and the duties of a free trader covered a wide range of knowledge and practice. One had to be equally expert with a blaster and a slingshot when the occasion demanded. Though Jellicoe had not fought a Salariki duel with a net and knife before, he had a deep memory of other weapons, other tactics which could be drawn upon and adapted to his present need. There was none of the casual atmosphere which had surrounded the affair between the Salariki clansmen in the hall. Here was ceremony. The storm priests invoked their own particular grim providence, and there was an oath taken over the weapons of battle. When the actual engagement began, the betting among the spectators had reached, Dane decided, epic proportions. Large sections of Sargolian personal property were due to change hands as a result of this encounter. As the chief priest gave the order to engage, both Terrans advanced from their respective ends of the fighting space with the half-crouching, light-footed tread of spacemen. Jellicoe had pulled his net into as close a resemblance to rope as its bulk would allow. The very type of weapon so far removed from any the traders knew made it a disadvantage rather than an asset. But it was when the icy moved out to meet the captain that Rip's fingers closed about Dane's upper arm in an almost paralyzing grip. He knows. Dane had not needed that bad news to be made vocal. Having seen the exploits of the Salariki duelists earlier, he had already caught the significance of that glide, of the way the IS champion carried his net. The Icy had not had any last-minute instruction in the use of Sargolian weapons. He had practiced, and by his stance knew enough to make him a formidable menace. The clamor about the Queen's party rose as the battle-wise eyes of the clansmen noted that, and the odds against Jellicoe reached fantastic heights, while the hearts of his crew sank. Only Van Rieke was not disturbed. Now and then he raised his smelling bottle to his nose with an elegant gesture which matched those of the befurred nobility around him, as if not a thought of care ruffled his mind. The icy fainted in an opening which was rather ragged. The icy fainted in a opening which was a rather ragged copy of the young Salaric's more fluid moves some hours before, but when the net settled, Jellicoe was simply not there. His quick drop to one knee had sent the mesh flailing in an arc over his bowed shoulders with a good 6 inches to spare. And a cry of approval came not only from his comrades, but from those natives who had been gamblers enough to venture their wagers on his performance. Dane watched the field and the fighters through a watery film. The discomfort he had experienced since drowning that mouthful of the cup of friendship had tightened into a fist of pain, clutching his middle in a torturing grip. But he knew he must stick it out until Jellicoe's ordeal was over. Someone stumbled against him, and he glanced up to see Ali's face, a horrible gray-green under the tan, close to his own. For a moment the engineer apprentice caught at his arm for support, and then with a visible effort straightened up. So he wasn't the only one. He looked for Rip and Weeks and saw that they too were ill. But for a moment all that mattered was the stretch of trampled earth and the two men facing each other. The icy made another cast, and this time, although Jellicoe was not caught, the slap of the mesh raised a red welt on his forearm. So far the captain had been content to play the defensive role of retreat, studying his enemy, planning ahead. The icy plainly thought the game his, that he had only to wait for a favorable moment and cinch the victory. Dane began to think it had gone on for weary hours, and he was dimly aware that the Salariki were also restless. One or two shouted angrily at Jellicoe in their own tongue. The end came suddenly. Jellicoe lost his footing, stumbled, went down, but before his men could move, the icy champion bounded forward, his net whirling out, only he never reached the captain. In the very act of falling, Jellicoe had pulled his legs under him so that he was not supine but crouched, and his net swept but at ground level, clipping the IS man about the shins, entangling his feet so that he crashed heavily to the sod and lay still. "The whip! That Laylock's whip trick!" Wilcox's voice rose triumphantly above the babble of the crowd. Using his net as if it had been a thong, Jellicoe had brought down the icy with a move the other had not foreseen. Breathing hard, sweat running down his shoulders and making tracks through the powdery red dust which streaked him, Jellicoe got to his feet and walked over to the IS champion, who had not moved or made a sound since his fall. The captain went down on one knee to examine him. "Kill! Kill!" That was the Salariki, all their instinctive savagery aroused, but Jellicoe spoke to Groft. "By our customs we do not kill the conquered. Let his friends bear him hence." He took the claw knife the icy still clutched in his hand and thrust it into his own belt. Then he faced the IS party in Kali. "Take your men and get out." The rein he kept on his temper these past days was growing very thin. "You've made your last play here." Kali's thick lips drew back in something close to a Salaric snarl, but neither he nor his men made any reply. They bundled up their unconscious fighter and disappeared. Of their own return to the sanctuary of the Queen, Dane had only the dimmest of memories afterwards. He had made the privacy of the forest road before he yielded to the demands of his outraged interior, and after that he had stumbled along with Van Rieke's hand under his arm, knowing from other miserable sounds that he was not alone in his torment. It was some time later, months, he thought when he first roused, that he found himself lying in his bunk, feeling very weak and empty, as if a large section of his middle had been removed, but also at peace with his world. As he levered himself up, the cabin had a nasty tendency to move slowly to the right, as if he were a pivot on which it swung, and he had all the sensations of being in a free fall, though the Queen was still firmly planted. That was only a minor discomfort compared to the disturbance he remembered. Fed the semi-liquid diet prescribed by Tau and served up by Mura to him and his fellow sufferers, he speedily got back his strength. But it had been a close call. He did not need Tau's explanation to underline that. Weeks had suffered the least of the four, he the most, though none of them had had an easy time, and they had been out of circulation 3 days. "The icy blasted last night."
Rip informed him as they lounged in the sun on the ramp, sharing the blessed lazy hours of invalidism. But somehow the news gave Dane no lift of spirit. I didn't think they'd give up. Rip shrugged. They may be off to make a dust-off before the board. Only thanks to Van and the old man, we're covered all along the line. There's nothing they can use against us to break our contract, and now we're in so solid they can't cut us out with the Salariki. Groft asked the captain to teach him that trick with the net. I didn't know the old man knew Laylock's whip fighting. It's about one of the nastiest ways to get cut to pieces in this universe. How's the trade going? Rip's sunniness clouded. Supplies have given out. Weeks had an idea, but it won't bring in Koros. That red wood he's so mad about. He's persuaded Van to stow some in the cargo hold, since we have enough Koros stones to cover the voyage. Luckily, the clansman will take ordinary trade goods in exchange for that, and Weeks thinks it will sell on Terra. It's tough enough to turn a steel knife blade, and yet it's light and easy to handle when it's cured. Queer stuff, and the color's interesting. That stockade of it planted around Groff's town had been up close to 100 years, and not a sign of rot in a log of it. Where's Van? The storm priest sent for him. Some kind of gabble fest on the star level, I gather. Otherwise, we're almost ready to blast, and we know what kind of cargo to bring next time. They certainly did, Dane agreed. But he was not to idle away his morning. An hour later, a caravan came out of the forest, a line of complaining, burdened orgils, their tiny heads hanging low as they moaned their woes, the hard life which sent them on their sluggish way, with piles of red logs lashed to their broad toads' backs. Weeks was in charge of the procession, and Dane went to work with the cargo plan Van had left, seeing that the brilliant scarlet lengths were hoisted into the lower cargo hatch and stacked according to the science of stowage. He discovered that Rip had been right. The wood, for all its incredible hardness, was light of weight. Weak as he still was, he could lift and stow a full-sized log with no great difficulty, and he thought Weeks was correct in thinking that it would sell in their home world. The color was novel, the durability an asset. It would not make fortunes as the Koros stones might, but every bit of profit helped, and this cargo might cover their fielding fees on Terra. Sinbad was in the cargo space when the first of the logs came in. With his usual curiosity, the striped tomcat prowled along the woods, sniffing industriously. Suddenly he stopped short, spat, and backed away, his spine fur a roughened crest. Having backed as far as the inner door, he turned and slunk out. Puzzled, Dane gave the wood a swift inspection. There were no cracks or crevices in the smooth surfaces, but as he stopped over the logs, he became conscious of a sharp odor. So this was one scent of the perfumed planet Sinbad did not like. Dane laughed. Maybe they had better have Weeks make a gate of the stuff and slip it across the ramp, keeping Sinbad on shipboard. Odd. It wasn't an unpleasant odor, at least to him it wasn't. Just sharp and pungent. He sniffed again and was vaguely surprised to discover that it was less noticeable now. Perhaps the wood, when taken out of the sunlight, lost its scent. They packed the lower hold solid in accordance with the rules of stowage and locked the hatch before Van Rieke returned from his meeting with the storm priests. When the cargo master came back, he was followed by 2 servants bearing between them a chest. But there was something in Van Rieke's attitude, apparent to those who knew him best, that proclaimed he was not too well pleased with his morning's work. Sparing the feelings of the accompanying storm priest about the offensiveness of the spacer, Captain Jellicoe and Steen Wilcox went out to receive them in the open. Dane watched from the hatch, aware that in his present pariahhood it would not be wise to venture closer. The Terran traders were protesting some course of action that the Salariki were firmly insistent upon. In the end, the natives won, and Costi was summoned to carry on board the chest which the servants had brought. Having seen it carried safely inside the spacer, the aliens departed, but Van Rieke was frowning, and Jellicoe's fingers were beating a tattoo on his belt as they came up to the ramp. "I don't like it," Jellicoe stated as he entered. "It was none of my doing," Van Rieke snapped. "I'll take risks if I have to, but there's something about this one." He broke off, 2 deep lines showing between his thick brows. "Well, you can't teach a Sasserole to spit," he ended philosophically. "We'll have to do the best we can." But Jellicoe did not look at all happy as he climbed to the control section, and before the hour was out, the reason for the captain's uneasiness was common property throughout the ship.
Having sampled the delights of off-world herbs, the Salariki were determined to not be cut off from their source of supply. 6 Terran months from the present Sargolian date would come the great yearly feast of the 50 Storms, and the priests were agreed that this year their influence and power would be doubled if they could offer the devout certain privileges in the form of Terran plants. Consequently, they had produced and forced upon the reluctant Van Riki the Koros collection of their order, with instructions that it be sold on Terra and the price returned to them in the precious seeds and plants. In vain the cargo master and captain pointed out that galactic trade was a chancy thing at the best, that accident might prevent return of the Queen to Sargol, but the priests had remained adamant, and saw in all such arguments only a devious attempt to raise prices. They quoted in their turn the information they had levered out of the company men, that traders had their code, and that once pay had been given in advance, the contract must be fulfilled. They, and they alone, wanted the full cargo of the Queen on her next voyage, and they were taking the one way they were sure of achieving that result. So a fortune in Koros stones, which as yet did not rightfully belong to the traders, was now in the Queen's strong room, and her crew were pledged by the strongest possible tie known in their service to set down on Sargol once more before the allotted time had passed. The free traders did not like it. There was even a vaguely superstitious feeling that such a bargain would inevitably draw ill luck to them, but they were left with no choice if they wanted to retain their influence with the Salariki. "Cutting orbit pretty fine, aren't we?" Ali asked Rip across the mess table. "I saw your 2-star man sweating it out before he came down to shoot the breeze with us rocket monkeys." Rip nodded. "Steen's double-checked every computation, and some he's done 4 times. He ran his hands over his close-cropped head with a weary gesture. As a semi-invalid, he had been herded down with his fellows to swallow the builder Murrah had concocted, and Tau insisted that they take. But he had been doing a half-night's work on the plotter under his chief's exacting eye before he came. "The latest news is that, barring accident, we can make it with about 3 weeks' grace, give or take a day or two." Barring accident. The words rang in the air. Here, on the frontiers of the star lanes, there were so many accidents, so many delays which could put a ship behind schedule. Only on the main star trails did the huge liners of the company ships attempt to keep on regularly timed trips. A free trader did not really dare to have an inelastic contract. "What does Stott say?" Dane asked Ali. "He says we can deliver. We don't have the headache about setting a course. You point the nose and we only give her the boost to send her along." Rip sighed. "Yes, point her nose." He inspected his nails. "Goodbye," he added gravelly. "These won't be here by the time that we plant here again. I'll have my fingers gnawed off to the first knuckle. Well, we lifted 6 hours. Pleasant strap down." He drank the last of the stuff in his mug, made a face at the flavor, and got to his feet, due back at his post in control. Dane, free of duty until the ship earthed, drifted back to his own cabin, sure of part of a night's undisturbed rest before they blasted off. Sinbad was curled on his bunk. For some reason, the cat had not been prowling the ship before takeoff as he usually did. First he sat on Van's desk, and now he was here, almost as if he wanted human company. Dane picked him up, and Sinbad rumbled a purr, arching his head so that it rubbed against the young man's chin in an extremely uncharacteristic show of affection. Smoothing the fur along the cat's jawline, Dane carried him back to the cargo master's cabin. With some hesitation, he knocked at the panel and did not step in until he had Van Riki's muffled invitation. The cargo master was stretched on the bunk, 2 of the take-off straps already fastened across his bulk as if he intended to sleep through the blast-off. "Sinbad, sir. Shall I stow him?" Van Riki grunted an assent, and Dane dropped the cat in the small hammock which was his particular station, fastening the safety cords. For once, Sinbad made no protest, but rolled into a ball and was promptly fast asleep. For a moment or two, Dane thought about this unnatural behavior and wondered if he should call it to the cargo master's attention. Perhaps on Sargol, Sinbad had had his equivalent of a friendship cup and needed a checkup by Tau. "Stowage correct?" The question, coming from Van Riki, was also unusual. The seal would not have been put across the hold lock had its contents not been checked and rechecked. "Yes, sir," Dane replied woodenly, knowing he was still in the outer darkness.
There is just the wood. We stowed it according to the chart.
Van Rieke grunted once more.
Feeling top layer again?
Yes, sir.
Any orders, sir?
No. Blast-offs at 6.
Yes, sir.
Dane left the cabin, closing the panel carefully behind him. Would he, or could he thought drearily, get back in Van Rieke's profit column again? Sargol had been unlucky as far as he was concerned. First, he had made that stupid mistake, and then he got sick, and now... What was the matter? Was it just the general attack of nerves over their voyage and the commitments which forced their haste, or was it something else? He could not rid himself of a vague sense that the Queen was about to take off into real trouble, and he did not like the sensation at all. And I think, perfect timing. That is where we're going to leave off tonight. We will pick back up on Thursday, so I hope you will rejoin me in a couple days as we continue Plague Ship by Andre Norton. Excuse me. Thank you so much for joining me tonight, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your weekend, and I hope you have a good night.